The morning of the auction, there were 19 scrawny heifers nobody wanted. They were a sorry collection, a painter's palette of mud and bone, huddled in the far corner of the back pen where the auction house shunted its mistakes and its hard luck cases. These were the calves born too late in the season, the ones that had failed to thrive on depleted pasture, the unfortunate daughters of weary mothers. Their ribs showed like the hoops on a forgotten barrel. Their hides were dull and patchy with the ghosts of winter coats they hadn't the strength to fully shed, and their eyes, large and dark, held a profound and listless weariness that seemed to drain the very light from the hot June morning. The other buyers, men with hands like worn leather and faces mapped by sun and worry, walked right past them. They moved with the confident, rolling gait of landowners, their boots scuffing paths in the dust toward the prime lots, toward the heavy-muscled Angus bulls and the broad-backed Hereford cows whose pedigrees were recited by the auctioneer in a rhythmic, hypnotic chant that was the true language of this place. The back pen, however, was a place of silence, save for the occasional, half-hearted cough from one of the heifers and the buzzing of flies that seemed to be the only creatures present with any energy at all. Ilara arrived after the bidding on the prize stock had already begun, parking her grandfather's rust-pocked truck far from the gleaming new Fords and Rams that sat like armored beasts near the main entrance. She was a slight figure in a world of bulk and substance, her frame lost in a pair of faded denim overalls and a simple cotton shirt, her face still holding the pale, indoor quality of the city she had just left behind. She walked with a quiet, deliberate pace that was entirely her own, a rhythm that did not match the urgent commerce of the auction yard. She bypassed the main arena, the sounds of the auctioneer's booming voice and the sharp crack of the gavel fading behind her as she made her way along the high wooden fences. Her eyes scanned not the prime animals, but the architecture of the place itself. The way the sun cut sharp lines across the dusty ground, the smell of manure and hay and hot metal, the lowing of cattle that was less a sound and more a vibration felt deep in the chest. She went directly to the back pen, the place the other men ignored as if by collective, unspoken agreement. There, she stopped and leaned her forearms on the top rail of the fence, its wood splintery and warm beneath her skin, and she simply watched the 19 unwanted heifers for a long time, longer than seemed reasonable to anyone who might have been paying attention. She did not prod or inspect, she observed. She watched the way one of them, a dun-colored thing with a Roman nose, stood guard while the others drank from the murky trough. She watched how a smaller black heifer, the weakest of the lot, always positioned herself in the very center of the herd, borrowing the warmth and the minimal protection of the bodies around her. She saw not a collection of failures, but a society, a fragile system that was, against all odds, still working. The bidding for the rejects began as an afterthought, a piece of procedural housekeeping before the lunch break. The auctioneer, a man named Henderson whose voice was gravelly from a lifetime of shouting numbers, barely gave them a proper introduction. All right, folks, lot 217, the whole shebang, 19 head of mixed-breed heifers, as is, where is, what am I bid for the lot? Let's start it at $500 for the bunch, a bargain for dog food. A few chuckles rippled through the remaining crowd. It was a joke, but a cruel one, grounded in the hard calculus of their world. These animals were worth more as rendered protein than as living stock. The price was an insult, a formality. Henderson was about to bang the gavel and move on when a hand went up at the back, a small hand attached to a slender arm. It was Ilara. Her bidding number, a flimsy piece of cardboard with 347 scrawled on it, wobbled slightly in the air. A surprised silence fell over the yard. Henderson squinted, his rhythm broken. I have $500 from bidder 347. Do I hear 550? He didn't. The other farmers looked at one another, some with amusement, some with a kind of pity. They saw a fool's bid, city money thrown away on a lost cause. Sold! Henderson finally barked, his gavel striking the block with a dismissive thud. To the young lady in the back for $500. The laughter that followed was not loud or malicious, but it was worse. It was soft, knowing, and communal. It was the sound of a closed world confirming its own wisdom by witnessing the folly of an outsider. As the other men began to drift toward the concession stand for coffee and barbecue, one of them, A man whose presence seemed to take up more space than his body required turned and looked directly at Alara. This was Marcus Thorne, a man whose family had farmed the valley for 4 generations. He was successful, respected, and loud. The owner of a sprawling, immaculate operation that ran on debt, diesel, and the latest chemical fertilizers. His hands were clean, his boots were polished, and his face was florid with the confidence of a man who had never been proven wrong in a public forum. He strode over to where she stood, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. He didn't address her directly at first, speaking instead to the men who formed a small court around him. "Well, I'll be," he boomed, a wide, insincere smile spreading across his face. "Looks like Arthur Vance's granddaughter's back in town and getting into the charity business." He finally turned his gaze on her, his eyes a pale, judgmental blue. "Miss, you just bought yourself 19 funerals. Those things will eat what little grass you've got on that rock pile your granddad left you, and then they'll have the decency to lie down and die. You'd have been better off setting a match to your $500. At least the fire would have kept you warm for a minute." His companions chuckled their agreement. It was a performance of dominance, a public lesson in the harsh realities she had dared to ignore. He had meant it as a prediction of failure, a pronouncement of her inevitable defeat. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. The farm she brought them home to was less a functioning agricultural enterprise and more a museum of a slow decay. Her grandfather Arthur had been gone for nearly a year, and her return was not a triumphant homecoming, but a retreat, a quiet surrender. She had spent 5 years in a city whose name she no longer liked to say, working a job in graphic design that had promised creativity but delivered only the sterile geometry of corporate logos and endless, soul-crushing revisions. The failure had been as quiet as her personality. There was no dramatic firing, no tearful resignation, just a gradual fading, a realization that she was a plant potted in the wrong soil, her own roots unable to find purchase in the concrete. The letter from the lawyer about the farm had felt less like an inheritance and more like a summons, a final responsibility she could not shrug off. So she had packed her few belongings, terminated the lease on an apartment that had never felt like home, and driven the long, lonely highway back to the valley, back to the leaning barn and the sagging porch that held the sum total of her family's history. The place was a burden, everyone had told her so. "Sell it," they advised. "Take the money and start fresh somewhere else." But standing on the porch that first evening, watching the fireflies begin to stitch the twilight together over fields thick with thistle and burdock, something in her had settled. The frantic, anxious energy of the city finally drained out of her, leaving behind a stillness she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't going to sell the burden. She was going to try to understand it. The house itself was a testament to a life lived with intention and care, now slowly being reclaimed by time. A fine layer of dust coated every surface, a soft gray blanket that muffled the past. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, dried herbs, and the faint, sweet smell of the pipe tobacco her grandfather had favored. For the first week, she did little more than walk. She walked the perimeter of the property, her boots sinking into the damp earth near the creek, her hands brushing against the rough bark of the ancient oak trees that marked the property lines. She learned the farm not as a map of acreage and assets, but as a living body. She saw the places where the soil was thin and stony, and the low-lying hollows where the ground stayed black and rich even in the afternoon sun. She saw the game trails worn into the woods by deer, and the high, lonely nests of hawks in the tops of the sycamores. The pastures were overgrown, a chaotic tangle of weeds and tough, unpalatable grasses that the neighbors' sleek cattle would have turned their noses up at. To Marcus Thorne, this was a rock pile. To Alara, it was a puzzle, a language she didn't yet know how to read. The fences were in a state of constant, slow-motion collapse. The cedar posts rotted at their base, the wire rusted and sagging like forgotten laundry lines. The barn, the farm's great gray heart, listed to one side, its roof a patchwork of old tin and new leaks. It was an overwhelming catalog of neglect, a decade of work for a dozen hired hands. For one woman with $500 left to her name, it was an impossibility. It was in the third week, during a bout of aimless cleaning born of frustration, that she found the notebooks. They were in a heavy oak roll-top desk in her grandfather's study, a room he had called his office, which had always been more of a library and natural history museum. The desk was locked, and the key was, of course, missing. She finally managed to pry it open with the blade of a sturdy kitchen knife, the wood groaning in protest. Inside, neatly stacked and tied with twine, were 24 ledger-style notebooks. Their covers were plain cardboard, their pages filled with a dense, elegant script that flowed across the paper with a steady, unhurried grace. They were not simple farm logs of expenses and yields. They were something else entirely. They were decades of conversations her grandfather had been having with his land. Each entry was dated, beginning in the spring of 1958 and ending just a few months before he died. He had recorded the weather not with numbers, but with descriptions: a sky the color of a bruised plum, or a thin, fretful rain that couldn't make up its mind. He noted the arrival of the first robins, the day the wild plum trees blossomed by the creek, the depth of the frost in the ground. It read like the field notes of a man studying something he loved, a meticulous, patient observation of a world most people were too busy to see. She spent the next several days doing nothing but reading, sitting in her grandfather's worn leather armchair as the sun moved across the dusty floorboards. The notebooks were a complete education in a philosophy of farming that had been all but forgotten, a quiet rebellion against the modern creed of speed, scale, and chemical intervention. He wrote about the soil not as dirt, but as a community of organisms, a slow, dark stomach that needed to be fed with care. He detailed his experiments with rotational grazing, moving his small herd not according to a rigid schedule, but according to the specific needs of the pasture, watching for the way the clover recovered, or the way the deep-rooted native grasses stood up to a dry spell. He had drawn detailed sketches of these plants in the margins, his pencil strokes capturing the delicate seed heads of bluestem and the saw-tooth edges of chicory leaves. He wrote about his animals with a deep, unsentimental affection, noting their individual personalities, their quirks, their subtle signs of health or distress. But it was in the 14th notebook, in an entry dated July 1978, that she found the passage that would become her compass. He was writing about a trip to the very same auction yard she had just visited. "They laugh at the thin one," he wrote. "They see only the failure, the bad luck. They do not see the genetics. A bull can grow fat on good grain and still carry weakness in its blood. But an animal that can survive a hard winter on poor forage, that can stay on its feet through sickness and hunger, that animal has a strength you cannot buy in a feed bag. It has the memory of survival written into its bones. Those are the ones. Buy the ones that stand in the middle of the pen. They know how to borrow strength. They know how to endure." The final sentence was underlined twice. "Debt," he had written in the margin in a slightly different ink, as if it were a later revelation, "is a man telling the future what it has to do. The land does not like being told." Armed with this new understanding, a fragile but growing sense of purpose, she drove out to see her great-aunt Maeve, her grandfather's older sister. Maeve lived in a small, tidy house at the edge of the county, a place that seemed to exist outside of time. She was 91 years old, her body bent and bird-like, but her eyes were as sharp and clear as blue river stones. She wore her husband's old flannel shirts and work trousers, her gray hair pulled back in a severe practical bun. She was a woman of few words, a living repository of the valley's unwritten history. Lara found her splitting kindling on the back porch with a small hand axe, each movement precise and economical. She did not waste energy in her actions or her speech. Lara told her about the heifers, about the laughter at the auction, and about the notebooks. Maeve listened without expression, her gaze fixed on the middle distance. When Lara finished, the old woman set down her axe and wiped her hands on her trousers. "Arthur was always watching," she said, her voice dry as autumn leaves. "The other men were always doing. They called him lazy. They didn't understand the work of watching." She looked at Lara then, a long, appraising look. "He told me about those notebooks, said they were the only thing of value he had to leave. He was right." She paused, then added the crucial piece of the puzzle, the practical key that unlocked her brother's philosophy. You got those heifers on the north pasture? The one that slopes to the creek? Ilara nodded. Move them, Maeve said. Put them in the high field, the one everyone calls the rock pile. The weeds up there, the deep ones with the bitter leaves. That's medicine. They'll eat it if they're hungry enough. It'll clean them out. Your granddad always said the land holds the cure if you know where to look. The work that followed was slow and unglamorous. A series of small, repetitive tasks that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Ilara spent the first week mending fences, not with new posts and wires she couldn't afford, but with what was at hand. She scavenged fallen limbs of black locust, a wood notoriously resistant to rot, and used her grandfather's old post-hole digger to set them deep in the earth. She walked the entire fence line, patiently splicing the broken wire, her hands, soft from her city life, quickly becoming calloused and scratched. It was grueling, solitary work, but she found a strange satisfaction in it, in the simple, honest ache in her muscles at the end of the day. She moved the 19 heifers to the high pasture, the so-called rock pile, just as Maeve had instructed. At first, the animals were skeptical, picking listlessly at the tough, unfamiliar plants. But hunger is a powerful motivator. Within a few days, she saw them grazing on the chicory and plantain, the very weeds her grandfather had sketched in his notebooks, labeling them tonics and blood cleansers. She began her own notebook, a modern echo of her grandfather's, recording her own observations. She noted which heifer was the leader, which ones preferred to graze in the shade, the subtle shift in the texture of their coats. She was not a commander imposing her will upon them. She was a student, learning their language, their needs, their nature. Her efforts did not go unnoticed, though they were profoundly misunderstood. The local feed store, Pratt's Ag and Seed, served as the county's true circulatory system, the place where news and gossip were exchanged with the same regularity as 50-pound bags of sweet feed. Elias Pratt, the proprietor, was a quiet, stooped man in his 70s who had known Ilara's grandfather well. He watched from behind his counter as Marcus Thorne and his lieutenants held court by the wood stove, even in the summer months. Thorne made a habit of inquiring after Ilara's progress with a theatrical, false friendliness that was more insulting than open mockery. "Morning, Elias," he'd boom, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Seen the Vance girl lately? Wondering how her bone collection is coming along." Or he would catch Ilara herself when she came in to buy a small bag of mineral salt, the only supplement she could afford. "Well now, Ilara," he'd say, leaning against a stack of feed bags, a smirk playing on his lips. "Heard you're trying to fence in that whole rock pile. You should know, rocks don't much care about fences, and neither do buzzards." His friends would snort with laughter, a chorus of masculine approval for their leader's wit. They saw her slow, patient work as folly, the pointless meandering of an amateur who didn't know the first thing about modern farming. They saw a woman playing with an inheritance she didn't deserve. Ilara, for her part, refused to take the bait. She had inherited her grandfather's quiet stubbornness, a quality that her city colleagues had often mistaken for passivity. When Thorne asked how her funerals were doing, she would look him squarely in the eye and answer plainly, without a trace of heat or defensiveness. "They're well, thank you for asking," she'd say. "They seem to enjoy the burdock." Her level, factual tone was a kind of conversational judo. It took the fun out of the question, robbing him of the emotional reaction he was trying to provoke. It left him and his friends in an awkward silence, unsure of how to proceed. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't defending herself. She was simply stating a fact, as if discussing the weather. This refusal to engage in their game of ridicule was more powerful than any angry retort. It created a small, protected space around her, a zone of quiet confidence that they could not penetrate. They could laugh at her, but they could not touch the core of what she was doing, because they did not and could not understand it. Her work was not for them. It was a continuation of the conversation her grandfather had started with his land, and she was the only other person who could hear it. There was one person in that store, however, who did not join in the laughter. Elias Pratt, from his perch behind the old wooden counter, saw something different. He remembered Arthur Vance bringing in soil samples in glass jars, not to be tested for nitrogen and phosphorus, but to show Elias the earthworms. "Look at that, Elias," Arthur would say, his voice full of a quiet reverence. That's the sign. That's the life. He remembered the other farmers, including a young Marcus Thorne, rolling their eyes, dismissing Arthur as an eccentric old man who was letting his farm go to ruin. Now, decades later, he saw the same quiet intensity in Arthur's granddaughter. He saw the way she studied the feed labels, not just for the protein content, but for the list of ingredients. He saw the purposeful way she moved, the lack of wasted motion that reminded him so much of her grandfather. One afternoon after Thorne and his cronies had left, leaving the scent of their cheap cigars hanging in the air, Elias spoke to her. He was bagging her mineral salt, and he paused, his gnarled hands resting on the sack. "Your granddad," he said, not looking at her. "He was a patient man. He always said, 'You can't hurry the ground.' People thought he was slow. He wasn't slow. He was just listening to a different clock." It was the first piece of external validation she had received, a small but significant confirmation that she was not entirely alone in her endeavor. It was a whisper of encouragement from the past, delivered by a quiet old man in a dusty feed store, and it was enough. The first tangible success came in the late autumn, a season of sharp, clear light and the smell of wood smoke on the air. The heifers, against all predictions, had not died. In fact, they were transformed. The medicine of the high pasture had worked its slow magic. Their coats, once dull and patchy, were now sleek and shining, their colors deep and rich, dun and black and red. The gaunt angles of their hips and ribs had softened, covered by a layer of healthy flesh. They moved with a new energy, their heads held high, their eyes bright and curious. They were still smaller than Thorne's pampered, grain-fed cattle, but they possessed a vitality, a wiry, resilient strength that his animals lacked. One crisp October morning, Elara was walking through the pasture and saw that the small black heifer, the one that had been the weakest of them all, had given birth during the night. The calf was tiny, a perfect miniature of its mother, and it was already on its feet, nudging insistently for milk. The mother, who had been on the brink of death just months before, stood over it, licking it clean with a fierce, protective love. Elara watched from a distance, a lump forming in her throat. She did not cheer or celebrate. She simply stood and witnessed the quiet, powerful miracle of it. Later that day, she recorded the birth in her notebook, her entry as spare and factual as her grandfather's had been. Black heifer calved. Female, healthy. But after she closed the book, she allowed herself a small, private moment of triumph. She sat on the porch steps as the sun went down, a mug of tea warming her hands, and she just sat with it, with the feeling of a promise kept, a trust rewarded. Her first sales happened almost by accident. Elias Pratt, her silent ally at the feed store, had a flock of chickens whose egg production had dwindled as the days grew shorter. He had a list of customers who depended on him for fresh eggs. Knowing Elara had a small flock of her own, chickens she had raised from chicks that spring, he asked if she might be willing to sell him a few dozen. Her hens, foraging freely on the rich pasture, were still laying with gusto. The yolks of their eggs were a deep, vibrant orange, the color of a harvest moon, a stark contrast to the pale, anemic yellow of commercial eggs. Elias's customers noticed the difference immediately. They commented on the flavor, a rich, complex taste they hadn't experienced in years. They tasted of clover and insects and sunshine. Word began to spread through the quiet underground network of the valley's kitchens. People began to drive down the long, rutted lane to her farm, asking to buy eggs directly. Then someone asked if she had any meat for sale. She had butchered a young bull calf for her own freezer, and she sold them a few pounds of ground beef. The report came back a few days later, full of superlatives. The meat was different. It was lean but deeply marbled, with a flavor that was clean and complex, a taste not of corn and confinement, but of the wild grasses and herbs the animal had eaten its entire life. A name for her small, accidental enterprise emerged organically, spoken first by a customer. "This stuff is just built different," he'd said. The name stuck. Burnt Fork Farm, named for the creek that ran through the property, began to earn a reputation, not through advertising or branding, but through the undeniable quality of what it produced. The following summer, the sky turned against the valley. It began subtly with a few mist thunderstorms in June. Then July arrived, hot and breathless. and the rain simply stopped. The sun, which had once been a force for life, became a relentless, punishing tyrant. A brassy, unforgiving haze settled over the landscape, bleaching the color from the sky. The creeks and ponds began to shrink, their edges receding to reveal cracked, thirsty mud. The corn in Marcus Thorne's vast fields, a monoculture crop dependent on immense quantities of water and nitrogen, was the first to show the strain. The broad leaves, which were supposed to be a lush, deep green, began to curl in on themselves, their edges turning a sickly, papery yellow. The pastures of the conventional farms turned from green to brown, to a pale, dusty tan. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a relief that never came. It was the worst drought in living memory, the old-timers said. Worse than the one in '88. Worse even than the legendary dry spell of the 1950s. The hard, confident talk at the feed store turned to hushed, anxious whispers about crop insurance, bank loans, and the soaring price of hay, which had to be trucked in from states hundreds of miles away. Farmers who had taken on massive debt to finance their large-scale operations were now facing ruin. They were forced to sell off their herds, trucking their prize-winning cattle to the same auction yard where Ilara had bought her rejects, selling them at a catastrophic loss just to stop the financial bleeding. The yard was full of the sounds of their defeat. In the midst of this widespread devastation, Burnt Fork Farm became an anomaly, an impossible island of green in a brown and desiccated county. Ilara's land was not immune to the drought, but it was resilient. The deep-rooted native grasses her grandfather had cultivated for decades, the chicory and plantain and bluestem, were able to draw moisture from deep within the earth, long after the shallow-rooted turf grasses of her neighbors had withered and died. Her pastures, managed with a careful rotation that never allowed them to be overgrazed, had a thick, spongy layer of organic matter that acted like a reservoir, holding on to what little moisture fell. Her animals, the descendants of the hardy survivors she had bought for a pittance, were accustomed to foraging, to making a living on what the land provided. They were lean and tough, perfectly adapted to their environment. They required no expensive imported hay. They drank from the spring-fed creek that still trickled through the bottom of the property, and they grew fat on the very plants that other farmers considered weeds. The contrast was so stark, it was almost unbelievable. People began to drive out along the county road that ran past her farm, slowing their cars to a crawl just to stare. They saw her cattle grazing peacefully in knee-high grass, their coats shining in the relentless sun. They saw a landscape that looked like it belonged to a different season, a different climate, a different world. The quiet, invisible work she had been doing for 2 years was suddenly, spectacularly visible. There was no need for arguments or explanations. The land itself was her vindication, a living, irrefutable testament to the wisdom she had chosen to follow. The mockery had fallen silent, replaced by a stunned, bewildered respect. One evening in late August, when the drought was at its most severe, a familiar, gleaming Ford truck pulled into Ilara's lane. It was Marcus Thorne. He drove slowly, as if he were a visitor in a foreign country, and parked near the barn. He got out and stood by his truck for a long moment, his hands in his pockets, just looking. He looked at the healthy, vibrant pasture. He looked at the calm, thriving cattle. He looked at the old barn, which Ilara had begun to repair, its new roof beams a pale, fresh-cut yellow against the weathered gray of the old wood. He had his hat in his hand. When Ilara came out of the house, he didn't offer a greeting. He just turned to her, his face grim, his usual bluster completely gone, replaced by a weary resignation. He gestured with his hat toward her fields. "How?" he asked. It was a single word, but it contained a universe of questions. How, when his own land was turning to dust? How, when his own cattle were thin and sick? How, when he had done everything right according to the experts, the seed salesmen, and the university extension agents? Ilara did not gloat. She did not remind him of his predictions of her failure. She simply answered him, her voice as calm and steady as it had been in the feed store. "My grandfather listened to the land," she said. "I'm just trying to do the same." Thorne looked at the ground, at the rich, dark soil teeming with life, and then he looked back at her. "I was wrong," he said. He didn't say it as an apology or as praise. He said it plainly, as a kind of grievance against the order of things, a reluctant admission that the world did not work the way he had always believed it did. The confession was just the beginning. Marcus Thorne, a man whose pride was as vast as his acreage, had been humbled not by an argument, but by a fact he could no longer deny. His visit was not just about admitting error, it was a pilgrimage. "I've got 150 head I'm going to have to sell next week," he said, his voice low. "I can't afford to feed them, but I have a few of my best cows left, my foundation stock. I won't sell them." He looked at her, a direct, pleading gaze. "I want to buy one of your young bulls. I'll pay whatever you're asking. I need those genetics. I need that toughness." It was the ultimate concession, a complete reversal of the auction yard hierarchy. The man who owned the best was now seeking to buy the bloodline of the rejects. But he went further. "And I want you to teach me," he said. "Show me what you're doing. Show me what your granddad knew." He offered to lease her some of his fallow pasture, to let her manage it her way as an experiment. He was a proud man, but he was also a pragmatist. He recognized that his own methods, for all their apparent success, were a house of cards, and the drought was the wind that was blowing them down. He saw in her quiet, patient stewardship not just a different way of farming, but the only way that was going to survive. Thorne's public conversion did what Alara's own success alone could not. It gave the other farmers in the valley permission to be curious, to admit that they might have been wrong. His word was still law in the county, and when he began to speak of Alara not with ridicule but with a grudging respect, the tide of opinion turned. The trickle of visitors to Burnt Fork Farm became a steady stream. Men who had laughed at her behind her back now showed up at her gate, their hats in their hands, their questions quiet and sincere. She became an unlikely teacher, a reluctant guru of a forgotten way. She didn't lecture or preach. She walked them through her fields just as she had walked them herself in those first lonely weeks. She had them crumble the dark, fragrant soil in their own hands. She showed them the intricate root systems of the native grasses. She pointed out the dung beetles, the earthworms, the bees, all the tiny overlooked laborers that made the system work. She shared passages from her grandfather's notebooks, letting his quiet, poetic wisdom speak for itself. She was not selling a product or a method. She was sharing a perspective, a way of seeing the land not as a factory to be exploited, but as a partner to be respected. Around this time, a local teenager named Leo started showing up at the farm after school. He was a serious, quiet boy from a family that had lost their own farm a generation ago. He never said much, but he was always watching, his eyes following Alara's every move. One day, he simply picked up a shovel and started helping her dig post holes for a new section of fence. He worked with a steady, tireless rhythm, his movements efficient and precise. He seemed to understand the work intuitively. He had, as Aunt Maeve would have said, the hands for it. Alara began to pay him a small wage, and he became her apprentice, her first and only student. He absorbed the knowledge of the notebooks not as a set of instructions, but as a philosophy. He learned to read the land, to see the subtle cues in the posture of an animal or the color of a leaf. He was the future of the farm, the next link in the chain, the living proof that her grandfather's legacy would not die with her. In his quiet, dedicated presence, Alara saw the successful transmission of knowledge, the passing of the torch to a new generation who would be tasked with healing the wounds of the old one. In the years that followed the great drought, Burnt Fork Farm flourished. The demand for her beef, her eggs, her lamb grew exponentially. She could have easily secured a large bank loan, expanded rapidly, bought more land, more animals, and become the new Marcus Thorne. The temptation was there, a siren song of conventional success. But her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do. She refused to take on debt. She refused to grow faster than the land could sustain. She grew the way a healthy pasture grows, letting the demand pull the operation forward organically, rather than pushing it with borrowed money. She bought more animals, always from the reject pens, always looking for that quiet, enduring strength in their bones. She leased the pasture from Marcus Thorne, and within 3 years, that depleted, chemical-soaked land was showing signs of recovery, the earthworms and the clover slowly returning. Her business philosophy was a direct extension of her farming philosophy. Patience over force, health over speed, resilience over brittle, debt-fueled growth. Great Aunt Maeve lived long enough to see it all. She lived to see Marcus Thorne's truck parked in her grandniece's lane, a regular and humble visitor. She lived to see the cars slowing on the road, their drivers pointing not with ridicule, but with admiration. One afternoon, Alara drove Maeve out to the farm, her ancient aunt sitting silently in the passenger seat of the old truck. Alara helped her out and walked her to the edge of the high pasture. Maeve stood there for a long time, her bird-like frame silhouetted against the lush green field, her sharp eyes taking it all in. She watched the healthy cattle grazing peacefully. She watched Leo, now a young man, mending a fence with quiet competence. Finally, she turned to Alara, and her weathered face broke into a rare, beautiful smile. Arthur would be proud, she said. It was the highest praise she could offer, the only validation Alara had ever truly needed. Maeve passed away peacefully in her sleep a few weeks later, her work as the keeper of the family's memory finally complete. Her death was not a tragedy, but a closing of a circle, the final, quiet transfer of the wise elder's mantle to the young woman who had earned it. The story ends as it began, at the auction yard. It is 5 years after Alara first stood in this place, a bewildered outsider. Today, she is not here to buy, but to sell. She is selling a young bull, a direct descendant of the small, weak black heifer that had been the first to calve on her farm. The bull is not massive or overly muscled like the others that will be sold today. He is lean, athletic, and possessed of a calm, intelligent confidence. When he is led into the ring, a hush falls over the crowd. These are the same men and the sons of the men who had laughed at her all those years ago. Now they watch with a focused, intense respect. The bidding is fierce and immediate, the numbers climbing rapidly. Marcus Thorne is there, but he doesn't bid. He is simply watching, a small, knowing smile on his face. The final price is astronomical, a new record for the yard. This time, no one laughed. They understood, finally, the value of what they were looking at. They were not just buying an animal. They were buying resilience. They were buying a history of survival. They were buying a piece of a story that had become a local legend. As the gavel fell, Alara felt a quiet, profound sense of completion. It was a victory not of shouting, but of stillness. It was the proof that the rejected thing is often the most valuable thing, if only you have the eyes to see it and the patience to understand it. That patience beats money and attention, beats force. That the old, slow wisdom of the earth is more powerful than the loud new wisdom of the machine. And that true worth, in the end, does not need to argue or defend itself. It does not need to boast or persuade. In the end, it simply proves itself, quietly and undeniably, like a green field in a time of drought.